Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Gaylyn Studlar, who's here to discuss the books she's worked on with Kevin Sandler, Titanic, Anatomy of a Blockbuster. Welcome to Rip Rap. Since we discuss academic books on Rip Rap, sometimes the topics can be esoteric or specialized. That's certainly not the case as far as rare kinds of knowledge with the enormously popular film on the tragic sinking of the Titanic passenger cruise ship on April 14, 1912. Indeed, it might be difficult to find someone who's not aware of the film or its story or the actors who played the key roles, the song, and the person who sang it. But what drew you and Kevin Sandler to seeing this as a topic for scholarly inquiry?
Well, it was a soy burger. we were having lunch over a soy burger, and we just talked. We like to talk film, just as colleagues, just friendly, what we liked, what we didn't like, and we came to the conclusion that both of us didn't have a very great regard for Titanic, and yet we were both rather amazed by how popular it was. I mean, obviously, it ultimately took in $1.7 billion worldwide, the most popular film ever made. And that really enticed us into, hey, this would make a great topic for a book, which is, why is this film so popular?
And why was it? My daughter would say it was Leonardo DiCaprio. But
well, that's because, I don't know how old she is, but that's because she is part of what actually more than one of our authors speculates was the driving force for the audience. We've got 13 different essays. They have 13 different answers. One of the things that we know for a fact is that the audience was 60% female. There are lots of other possible reasons. How long do you want me to go on, Jim?
Go ahead.
Well, one of the obvious things, of course, is that it combines both the romance, right, and spectacle. It's an action film. So in some ways, it's really recapitulating that kind of scope of appeal. And how many different ways can you appeal to an audience that we associate with something like Gone with the Wind in traditional Hollywood filmmaking. It's even got the appeal of a budget. I mean, how many people went to see this film because they want to see the most expensive film ever made, and then after a while they want to see what the most profitable film ever made looks like. And then we have some of our scholars speculate on perhaps some of the more esoteric academic reasons, a kind of nostalgia for an era past that is not, really at one with us, but seems to be something that we'd like to partake in. The idea of actually participating in a disaster experience. Many different possible reasons, including those that are peculiar to 14-year-old girls.
Well, that aspect of the spectacle was really quite spectacular. I mean, they got this construction of the ship, and they had this. Then they have a whole tank or something. But along with it, there was the issues of how they filmed. I mean, how all the stuff they had to go through to do this, the sinking process and all that.
Right. It was in some ways unprecedented in terms of James Cameron's. His desire to make a film that looked authentic, the set for it, the model, which was only really half. They only filmed one side of it, and they would flip it in post-production in terms of literally on the film to make it look like the other side. But still, it was a 90% of the size of the original Titanic. All the huge numbers of extras, and of course, now with the wizardry of digital, right, what you can't provide in a kind of real-life construction, you can digitalize in afterwards. So in some ways, it's unprecedented in terms of the spectacle because it provides that kind of seamless combination of modern technology with digital and the old-fashioned large construction sets, many extras, etc., that we associate with old-style Hollywood filmmaking. So in some ways it gives us the pleasure of both of those. What part of this is actually real, what part of it is fake. And of course, we can speculate that a lot of people wanted to see if this is going to be such a close recreation of what it looked like, then they want to see what the china floating in the first class salon must have looked like. So this is their chance to get an opportunity to see what the Titanic and its sinking was like in a way perhaps that they couldn't get close to in any other way.
Well, one of the unique things about the Titanic and of James Cameron is they actually went down in that submergible.
Right,
and
12 times.
12 times.
Yeah, at the
and
cost of
included
$3 million.
film with that. Yeah, it was. I don't know if I'd go that far.
Well, part of the obsession associated with him as a filmmaker who, of course, wanted to get it right. And in the beginning, I think a lot of the scuttlebutt around Hollywood is that why was this necessary? $3 million just to go down to the Titanic as it sits there now under how many miles of water. But I guess Cameron was fascinated with that since it was discovered in 1985 by Dr. Robert Ballard. And he managed to incorporate that, what most critics thought quite ingeniously, in the framing story, right, where he establishes the old Rose, he establishes her as a kind of human metaphor for the ship on the bottom of the ocean, something that's old, that's ruined, etc. So he, what first looked like perhaps the overzealousness of a movie maker with too much money actually turned out to have what many critics thought was a quite important role in establishing the mood, the sentimentality, the emotional handle that the film had on its audiences.
And this was at the same time that these people who were trying to explore it, there was a controversy about, should you approach the ship, and, there were still bodies, or, that may have still been on there among the 1,500 that sank with the ship.
Right. That's not talked about very much in the film, but the film establishes that through the head of the salvage operation, the fictional character in the film, who only sees it in terms of monetary gain, of trying to find the safe, of trying to locate all those valuables that were believed to have gone down with the ship.
Well, the popularity of the film kind of exacerbated that whole issue.
Absolutely.
And people also, I think, had dollar signs in their minds about what this all might mean.
Absolutely.
And the value of all the artifacts.
Right. Well, I mean, there's that funny or tricky thing about making popular culture, or this kind of product, which has such incredible popular appeal, which still resonates really emotionally with the grief of people who either were in the disaster, the very few survivors that I think they're left, who were basically infants or children when they were on board, or the people who, of course, are related to those folks. And so you're right, the idea that in some ways it's a graveyard as well as being a site of adventure. And that contrast between the two is actually picked up in the film, in the framing story between Rose and her memory, which is really fraught with all this emotional baggage, and the salvage operators who are only interested in the cash. So the film manages to play on that within its narrative line, too.
I couldn't help wondering if this had something to do with the end of the millennium. If there was this sort of structure to it, and it's a huge project.
Well, several of our contributors certainly agreed with that assessment. The idea of survivalism and how in the film Rose's survival, of course, becomes a really crucial, I hate to use the word metaphor again, but since this is an academic program, we can't.
Sure.
Metaphor.
Metaphor is perfectly acceptable on this program.
For the notion of survival. The idea that the disaster is going to be all-encompassing. Everybody's going to die, so how are we going to save ourselves? And that it has to be, we have to save ourselves. One of the interesting things that I learned about the actual production of the film was that Cameron was insistent that none of the extras help each other when the boat was going down. That he didn't want acts of heroism, that he didn't want people helping each other or trying to prevent others from going overboard or getting hurt or whatever, that he literally just yelled at them for don't touch her, don't help him, etc. That he wanted this sense of the individual having to cope for themselves in the attempt to survive. And that's very different than previous incarnations of this story. The most well-known probably is the 1958 British film that was based on A Night to Remember and is of the same name, in which you have many individual acts of heroism focused on by the camera. There's this particularly poignant one where an older gentleman is trying to protect a little boy from being trampled on as the boat is turning and everybody's forcibly going down with gravity. But Cameron, in some ways, whether he was conscious of that attention to a kind of millennial mindset, we don't know, or he hasn't really articulated, but in some ways he's articulated it in the film in the sense of who's going to save Rose? Well, in the end, she has to save herself.
But that also points up an important issue about the difference between the film and actuality. The film being a construction of a creative interpretation of an event. And so you have the framing story, like you said, and this thing about going and visiting, but then the actual event may have been something somewhat different as it happened.
Absolutely, and that is one of the fascinating things about film in particular that deals with historical events. And this film, one of the reasons I was so surprised that this film was popular was that it was based on a historical event, which is, 80-some years? Can we count now?
90.
We're in the new millennium.
88.
Right, and even though the loss of life at the time was found shocking, 1,535 people, by other tragedies in the 20th century, for example, the Holocaust, the amount of life lost was minuscule. And historically, in some ways, it was regarded as a kind of simple event. What were the causes? Well, some of them are still argued about whether or not the ship was going too fast on its maiden voyage because the White Star Line wanted to set a speed record, or whether, for a long time they thought maybe the steel plates were not adequately welded, and now after Ballard went down and they have actually been at the ship and done tests on the steel, they found out that wasn't true. But obviously the loss of life most centrally was attributed to the fact that there weren't enough lifeboats. The lifeboats only held maximum approximately 1,100 people, and because they hadn't had any drills, there was no expectation, that this ship, which was the most expensive and biggest and most technologically advanced ship of its time, would sink on its maiden voyage. So they only actually managed to get about 800 people into them, and the Titanic held at its maximum capacity of 3,500. So historical events, particularly ones that I think, like this one, seem to resonate more mythologically than actually having an influence on our lives. It resonates mythologically because here's an example of the hubris of technology. The ship that couldn't sink.
That's right.
Right, and so historically, that is something that I think lends itself to lots of different interpretations. And the film, obviously, is a product of its time. And so James Cameron's interpretation, having these kind of millennial overtones, having in some ways emphasis on a very feisty heroine. I love that scene where I think she's running down the corridor with water up to her knees with the axe, right? She's got to rescue Jack from where he's chained up to a pipe, which has happened because her nefarious fiance, wants him to go down with the ship. But I think we're attracted to that in part. We're looking for a measure of authenticity. We want to invest somewhat in this historical detail, but I think we also want this kind of freedom of the fictional. And so that's what Hollywood film traditionally has provided. Gone with the Wind is not an accurately depicted version of the Civil War, and it may not even be those moments of verisimilitude, like when the camera cranes back at, if you remember, on the Atlanta Railway, right, where all those bodies. What somebody may remember is when Scarlett is pulling down the drapes from the O'Hara mansion in order to make a dress to go to the jail, so that she looks as if she's prosperous, when she talks to Rhett Butler. So that blend of fiction and history may have different value for different people. Titanic buffs may go to it and be very upset that certain details are not accurate, while other people may just sort of take in the experience and it's enough for them. Maybe Cameron could have made the film for a quarter of that and had enough verisimilitude or authenticity to satisfy most moviegoers. But obviously the idea that he spent that much money, the expectation was that it's going to be seen on screen, and that, I think, was part of the appeal, too. What is this going to look like? It's got to be fabulous. It's got to be accurate. It's going to be exciting in terms of special effects. This is another reason to see this film.
But it is true, this entire constellation or assembly of different factors all contributed, including the song, Celine Dion, and those different things kept resonating through the culture,
Right.
and kept playing back to the film.
And that was one reason we thought we really needed to move and examine the film while it was still fresh on people's minds and while it was still reverberating the culture, while you still would see Titanic jokes in the comic strips and you'd hear references and just, you'd see references all over. This is like Titanic and this is like Titanic. And the idea of film historians obviously examining the idea of reception. And for us to examine the idea of how was a film received, why, what were the dimensions of this reception, not only in the numbers, but who, the global scheme of it, the local, the marketing, like with the soundtrack being very important, obviously, to the marketing of the film. We thought that this was a great opportunity because this film was so ubiquitous through the culture at a particular moment in 97 and 98, to take a hold of it right then and have these scholars examine the sort of force field of the different possibilities for reception while they were still circulating the culture, rather than trying to reconstruct them for a film that was released 50 years earlier.
The thing that kept being at the back of my mind is, why did it play worldwide so deeply? I mean, with the same intensity that it did in this country?
That's a really good question. That's a good question. Cross-cultural appeal is still something that a lot of film historians and critics that we're still grappling with. One answer, of course, is that American culture has saturated the globe, and that it's often seen as being superior, partly because of technology, that Americans just make movies better than anyone else. There's also the idea that certain stars are popular in other countries. For example, DiCaprio is very popular in Japan. And so they actually had the premiere of the film in Japan because they wanted a very enthusiastic premiere. One of our articles examines the reception of the film in Southampton, Britain, which of course was the location of where Titanic disembarked from the UK and where lots of the staff of the ship were located, and also compares that against the general reception in England, with a very interesting kind of tag of if any community had the right to be upset with a film that wasn't 100% accurate, then this community would be. But yet, Titanic was incredibly popular in Southampton. And why it's popular in other countries, as another one of our articles that examines the internet discussions of Titanic, particularly among teenage girls. Again, that American culture really saturates the globe, and that there's some aspects of the marketing, particularly the emphasis on the romance, the emphasis on the music, that in some ways break down cultural barriers. That media, especially at this point in time, is really learned to commodify itself across cultural differences with the permeation of American cultural standards all across the globe.
What I thought is that it had this formula that answered sort of a basic thing. One was you had a romance.
Romeo and Juliet.
Yes, and it was easy to like the two main characters with that. You had a tragedy.
Right.
And a large one, excuse me, and so spectacular that, and people who've been through earthquakes and bombings and everything can identify with something huge happening like that. You also had a sort of an inter-ethnic element to it, so there's a mixture there, so that it broadens it out, and then you had the musical, part of it, and some very savvy marketing, I think, was key to, like you're saying, having it open in Japan, and how it was packaged up. But it's extraordinary. I think it's the biggest film worldwide now.
Well, it had elements that would attract people from different demographic segments. You don't want to alienate, I think it's something like 16 to 25-year-old males. So you had enough action to keep them involved. And it also had the appeal to the females of the romance and of Leo DiCaprio. And it had the historical element, the kind of costume spectacle element, and you could even argue the music and the emotionalism, the period piece kind of appeal. You're right, the class consciousness in the film is played very smartly, where we get to enjoy the upper class setting, because the romance mainly takes place in the upper class setting, so we get to enjoy all of that, and yet there's that one great scene where they go down and dance with the third class folks.
Well, people like wealth and richness and, you know, the upper crust kind of a treatment, but at the same time there's that, you know, the emotional appeal of the...
Right. And then, of course, the film solves that by, as one of our articles talks about, I think very intelligently, that asserts this imperial middle, that the middle class is actually the one that wins out, because we see from Rose's life that that's where she actually emerged, is in the comfortable middle class. So she's born into the wealthy class that suffocates her. She escapes through Jack, the lower class artist, and then she emerges into this middle class. So it's the American dream.
Well, we certainly didn't get a film of the sinking of Lusitania, you know, in World War II. I think that's the reason.
It'd be tougher.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I know. What would you do with the Germans in that one? See, here it's just an iceberg, so it doesn't have to stir up any old nationalistic resentments. And that's another kind of thing. It's the idea of fate, right? The hand of fate. And the film treats that in a way that is, some people might regard as rather silly, but in the world of this film, which is rather melodramatic, it makes entire sense, which is, if you might remember that the sailor looks down from the crow's nest, and he's distracted by seeing Rose and Jack kiss, and that's when they hit the iceberg. If only he'd been paying attention.
The earth moved. One of the elements in this film is, like all major works of art, the meticulousness of those who are producing it, with attention to detail, and it has these specific images, and you've already mentioned some of them, but there is that image of Rose and Jack, arms outstretched in the bow of the ship, and Rose's dream of heaven, and then her flinging away of the fabled diamond. What other details did you see, or do you?
I think those two are really worth talking about. The appeal of those two, I think, have a lot of resonance with the teenage female audience and the whole notion of freedom, because they do center around Rose. I mean, in some ways, it's decidedly her story, and I think it's a great example too of how savvy Cameron is in handling film as a visual medium. The idea that the Rose and Jack on the prow of the ship becomes so emblematic of that film, and it's reiterated, I think, in posters, and it was reiterated a lot in the marketing of the film, right? And so it's very smart, because they're not within either the boundaries of his world, right, the third class world, or her world. They're free, right, on the prow of the ship, and it's just the ocean and the air. It's very romantic in that, freeing them from the strictures of class, where it's just love instead of love in a specific kind of cultural and social context, which of course is what this film is about, which is freeing both of them in a way. Of course, he has to die to be free.
How inconvenient.
But
rather coldly also.
Rather coldly, I know, dying of hypothermia. But I think the film, part of the appeal again is that those kind of moments give us a kind of visual hook to hang our emotional hat. Just like I think a good comparison is the moment in Gone with the Wind where Rhett is taking Scarlett back to Tara, and they get down, and he insists on kissing her, and then there's that kind of orange, impossibly orange Technicolor sunset in the background, and they're almost in silhouette, and it's one of those moments that just lifts itself out by its visual and musical effect. And I think this film is very smart in doing the same thing.
And the Casablanca scene with
At the
Humphrey
end,
Bogart, yes.
with the airplane.
And
yeah.
the fog and this.
Absolutely.
Which suggests that maybe that's something that, those producing these films have to really look for, is, having some special moment that's emblematic of the entire project.
I think that's true, and I think directors who are capable of thinking visually can do that. And I think Cameron had proved that in the past with Terminator 2, and with some of his other projects. I mean, whether we love him or hate him, he still knows how to manipulate his medium. He did that very well with casting, too, with particularly the principals in Titanic, and how he utilizes the ship. All of that is done with a certain kind of visual force that also makes the film an experience for people. There are lots of reviewers who claim that they cried a tear or two, and they were trying to cynically keep themselves distanced from it, but it got to them anyway. And I think
so.
that
The skill of Cameron overcame what could have been a conventional story.
I think so. I think that's perfectly true.
You yourself just said it changed you in a way. You started off talking about, well, let's do this book on Titanic, but then as we've been talking, you've been indicating that it had some insights in filmmaking and so forth.
Oh, well, I think it's, I think a popular film in some ways should lend itself to analysis, even if we, if it's not aesthetically our cup of tea, or we don't find it compelling, or for whatever reason we don't think it's the film that we want to take to a desert island, and I think Titanic's popularity in a certain way demands analysis. I mean, why does this film at a particular moment in time gain such popularity? And film studies has, I think, been, as an academic field, has been a little reluctant to address popular films unless they happen to coalesce with already standing interests of film critics. I mean, there are not that many books on, I don't know, Bing Crosby and Bob Hope films from the 1940s, yet those were among the most popular films of the era. And so I think, I don't want to call it snobism, but maybe it is. I mean, we tend to want to analyze what we love, and popular films sometimes are not the ones that academic critics and historians believe are the most worthy of attention. So there may be a high art, low art kind of split. So this particular film, I hope the book has any effect on my academic field, is that it will encourage other explorations of popular films when they appear.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
My pleasure.